The leash snapped tight like a whip crack. Not from exhaustion. Not from distraction. From certainty. And certainty in a trained German Shepherd doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives, absolute and undeniable, the way the ground arrives when you fall. Daniel Hayes stood on an old forest road in a mountain valley that most maps barely acknowledged, and he watched his dog plant all four legs in the snow like an anchor dropped to the ocean floor. Amber eyes locked forward, ears raised to full attention. A growl rolling from somewhere deep in that broad chest, low, controlled, and completely wrong for a place this quiet. Daniel followed the dog's gaze into the pines. He saw branches, shadows, snow drifting sideways off the treetops. And then the wind changed angle, and he saw what Ranger had already read from 30 meters away. Fresh footprints pressed deep into the white ground. Work boot tread, sharp and clean, coming out of the forest toward the cabin road. But not one single track going back in. Someone had walked out of those woods, and had not walked back. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath clouding in the iron-gray air. He looked at his dog. His dog looked at the dark between the trees. And neither of them moved for a very long time. But to understand why those footprints mattered, to understand what was really waiting at the end of them, you have to go back 3 days. Back to the moment Daniel Hayes first drove into Gray Hollow Valley. Back to the moment his dog told him, in the only language a dog has, that something in this place was not what the world pretended it was. Daniel was 38 when he bought the cabin. 12 years of military service had built him the way a long winter builds a tree, slowly, under pressure, into something dense and difficult to move. He carried himself with the economy of a man trained to conserve everything. Hair cut short by habit, beard trimmed close, gray-green eyes that held the quiet weight of someone who had seen too much and was still deciding what to do with whatever was left. He told people he wasn't running from anything. He told himself the same thing the afternoon he paid full asking price on a remote mountain cabin without negotiating a single dollar, bought it the same day the listing went live. No cell signal. A road that became an argument with weather by mid-January. The listing called it a retreat. Daniel called it a destination. The difference mattered to him. Ranger rode in the passenger seat as always. Not in the back. Beside Daniel, like a colleague. He had been a military working dog before he was Daniel's dog, trained for patrol and detection in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. His coat was thick and cream and black. His intelligence was the kind that made observers uncomfortable because it looked too much like thought. When Daniel pulled into the valley and Ranger jumped from the truck, the dog didn't sniff new ground with excitement. He just went still, looking past the open meadow toward the distant dark forest behind the cabin. Still the way a compass needle went still after finding north, not because motion stopped, but because direction had been found. Daniel noticed. He always noticed what Ranger did. Because over 5 years together, the dog had been almost never wrong. Before driving to the cabin, Daniel stopped in town, a place called Gray Hollow, built like one long exhale. One main road, one gas station, a diner called Mabel's that smelled like pine resin and old coffee. He ordered black coffee without being asked. The woman behind the counter, 50s, efficient, the watchful patience of someone who had read Strangers for decades, poured it, set the pot down slower than necessary, and asked if he was the one who'd bought the old Brennan place. He said yes. Something shifted in her face. Not alarm exactly. The careful expression of someone deciding how much truth a stranger could handle in the first 5 minutes. She leaned forward. People heard things in that forest, she said. Lights near the tree line after dark. Sounds that animals didn't make. Dogs that refused to go near the eastern forest after sundown. Daniel told her he'd slept in worse places. She nodded. Then she leaned 1 inch closer and said that 3 years ago, a trapper named Roy Callahan went into those woods in November. Roy had known that forest better than any man alive. He could navigate the backcountry blind in a blizzard. He never came back. At the far end of the counter, a man with a ceramic mug halfway to his lips turned his head slightly at the sound of that name. Just enough. And then turned back to his food without a word. As if he'd heard the name too many times to react anymore. But not quite enough times to stop flinching. The cabin was solid, Thick timber walls darkened by decades, a clean stone chimney, big windows facing a frozen river. Normal signs everywhere: deer tracks, bird tracks, the reassuring arithmetic of a world still operating by familiar rules. But the forest behind the cabin felt different. Not strange the way unfamiliar places felt strange. Wrong the way a room felt wrong when something had happened inside it and the walls still remembered. Ranger moved the perimeter methodically, nose reading the snow. He covered 3 corners. And then he reached the eastern corner, the corner that faced the forest, and stopped. Body locked. Ears forward. Daniel turned to follow the dog's attention and saw one branch shift near the pines. One branch. No wind. Nothing else moved. He said aloud it was probably a deer. Ranger didn't move. He stood at the corner of the yard and stared into the trees the way a man stared into a building he'd been told was empty, and was no longer convinced. That first evening Daniel got the wood stove burning, filled the cabin with pine smoke and amber heat, and found a wall calendar still turned to October, 3 years back. He stood looking at that stop date for a long moment. Evidence of a life simply abandoned mid-sentence. Ranger explored every room with professional focus, and then stopped in front of the back window, the window facing the forest, and sat. And stared. He didn't move from that position until the light was completely gone and the forest became a solid wall of black. Daniel asked his dog what he was looking at. Ranger didn't answer. He just watched. Past midnight the wind arrived, not crashing in, but pressing steadily, making the old timbers creak. Daniel sat cleaning his rifle by the fire. Ranger lay near the door with his head up, eyes tracking something Daniel's senses couldn't locate. And then, close to 2 in the morning, Ranger stood. Slowly. Deliberately. The kind of rising that said the situation had graduated from possibility to fact. He walked to the front window. Went rigid. And a growl vibrated through his chest so low Daniel felt it in his own sternum before he heard it. Daniel was at the window in 3 steps. Outside, snow drove sideways across the yard. The wooden bridge over the frozen river was barely visible through the storm. And then the nothing outside resolved into something. A figure stood at the far end of the bridge, motionless as a post, facing the cabin. Watching. Not moving. Not seeking shelter. Just watching. Daniel's pulse didn't spike. Genuine training meant the body settled when danger was real, breathing dropping into the long rhythm that kept a man functional. He watched the figure. The figure watched back. For nearly 2 full minutes, neither moved. Then the wind shifted, and the figure stepped backward, once, twice, and was swallowed by the storm as if it had simply unwritten itself from existence. Daniel moved for the door immediately, jacket in hand, fingers on the lock. And then Ranger stepped in front of him. Not barking. Not snarling. He pressed his entire body sideways against Daniel's legs and looked up with those amber eyes, steady, certain, and completely calm. Not fear. Not aggression. A warning with restraint. The weight of a body that had earned the right to say, "Not yet." Daniel had worked with military dogs in conditions where the wrong decision meant body bags. He knew every register of a working dog's communication. This wasn't prey drive or panic. This was his partner speaking in the only language available to him, with complete seriousness. "Trust me." Daniel let go of the lock. He stepped back. Ranger returned to the window. Daniel stood behind him for a full hour watching the dark yard fill with blowing snow. The figure did not come back. But the morning showed him something far worse than a figure in a storm. He stepped outside at dawn into the post-storm stillness and found the tracks. One set. Work boot tread, sharp and fresh. They came from the forest, crossed the bridge, approached the cabin, turned around, and walked back toward the tree line. That alone would have made his neck cold. But halfway between the cabin and the trees, the tracks simply ended. Not filled by drift. Not faded by wind. They ended mid-stride, clean and precise, as if the person who made them had stepped sideways out of physical existence at that exact spot in the white ground. Daniel stood over that last footprint for a long time. Ranger was staring into the forest. And somewhere deep between the trunks, something moved with a geometry too deliberate, too angular, to belong to any animal he could name. Someone had stood outside his cabin in a blizzard for 2 hours. And their tracks ended in the middle of an open yard, in the middle of a sentence, and led nowhere. He drove to town. The sheriff's office was small and precise, one cruiser with a dented bumper out front. Inside, a woman in her late 30s with dark hair and a pressed uniform sat behind a carefully ordered desk. Name tag, Adler Jung. He told her about the figure, the tracks that ended mid-stride. She set her pen down slowly, not with surprise, but with the careful movement of someone hearing a thing she'd heard versions of before and didn't enjoy hearing again. Unusual reports, she said. Lights at the tree line. Dogs that refused the forest. She used the word unusual the way people used soft language when the direct language was too serious for a government building. Daniel asked if anyone had identified the figure. Adler said, not definitively. He repeated that word. Tasted it. Found it insufficient for what it was being asked to carry. Adler wrote a number on a card and slid it across the desk. If you see it again, call before you go outside. Daniel told her he wasn't the kind of man who waited for permission. Adler looked at him with level eyes and said this valley had a way of making experienced people careful. No drama in her voice. Which was precisely why it landed heavier than anything dramatic would have. He stopped at the hardware store. Old Pete behind the counter, white beard, one milky eye, the other sharp as a nail, didn't offer a greeting. Just looked at Daniel's items and said he was the one who took the Brennan place. Daniel said yes. Pete asked if he had a dog. German Shepherd, Daniel said. Pete nodded slowly, as if that resolved something. Then, counting change with fingers that had known decades of mountain cold, he said, the dog will hear things before you do. He'll know things you won't. Don't ignore him, especially when what he's telling you doesn't seem to make sense. Especially then. Daniel asked what the dog would hear. Pete looked at him with that one clear eye. The storm that's coming, he said. Then went back to counting. The second night. Past 2 in the morning. A slow, rhythmic dragging along the exterior of the back wall. Wood against wood. Patient. Deliberate. Like something measuring the logs from outside, pressing against them, learning their thickness, their age. Daniel had his rifle at the rear window before the sound repeated 3 times. The motion sensor above the back door was dark. Nothing had triggered it. But the sound continued. Ranger turned and looked at Daniel with those amber eyes. Do not open that door. Daniel controlled his breathing and waited. The sound stopped. Silence fell like water filling a vessel. Then the motion light exploded on, white and total. Daniel swung to the glass. Nothing in the yard. Bright snow. Black tree line. Complete stillness. But the snow banked against the back wall, directly against the logs, 1 foot from where he'd been sleeping, had been disturbed. Not footprints. Something large had crouched there, compressed itself into the drift. Something had been against the exterior of his cabin while he slept, studying the building from outside, with one thin wall of timber between them. Ranger made a sound then that Daniel had heard only once before in 5 years together. Not a growl. Not a bark. A single low sustained note, a warning call from somewhere older than training. Something that felt less like alarm and more like recognition. Like memory reaching backward across a very long time. Daniel returned to Adler and described it all. She listened without picking up her notepad, which meant she was hearing this outside the register of any official report. When he finished, she asked if he'd been in service. 12 years, he said. 3 deployments. She was quiet for a moment that had real weight. Then she opened a locked drawer and set a thick folder on the desk between them. She said quietly, not looking at him, "You're not the first person to sit in that chair and ask about Roy Callahan." Inside the folder were photographs. Footprints walking out of a forest and simply stopping. A rope on a tree trunk tied in a military load-bearing knot, not a trapper's knot, not a field improvisation. A rough woven structure photographed at dusk between the pines. And Roy Callahan himself, alive and smiling, standing by a truck with a trapping catch. Date stamp, November 14th, 3 years ago. Missing 4 days later. Official determination, accidental death. No body. Daniel said that aloud. Accidental death. No body. Adler said the determination came from the county, not from her. Daniel said she believed it was something else. Adler gathered the photographs back and said Roy had walked that forest for 30 years. He didn't get lost. He didn't have accidents. Whatever was in those trees was still there. And the question she carried home every night, the one she woke up with every morning, was what it wanted. He drove back toward the cabin with that sentence sitting in his chest like a cold stone. He passed a small stone house set back from the road, smoke from the chimney, and a face watching through the iced window. He didn't plan to stop. But stopping felt like the only honest thing available. He knocked. An ancient woman opened the door, thin as birch, eyes sharp as winter sky. Elsa Van. She poured tea and told him he'd been hearing things. Not as a question. She said her husband had spent decades mapping the valley's backcountry. In the last year of his life, he documented something in the deepest section of the forest, a region marked on maps simply as unrouted and subject to seasonal variation. He called it the hollow ground. The temperature was always 2 or 3 degrees colder there, air pressure slightly off. And the silence, absolute, total, without birds or insects or the small constant noise that life made when it was comfortable. He went back with instruments from the university in October. He came home that evening. But he wasn't entirely right when he came home. He sat in a chair for 3 days. Barely ate. Said nothing. And on the 4th day, one sentence, the only one he ever offered: it knows we're here. It has always known. And it is deciding. Daniel asked what it was deciding. Elsa looked at Ranger lying near her feet and said, "That's what your dog is for. The old ones always know." That night Daniel spread maps across the kitchen table. County Survey. Forest Service map 15 years old. And a hand-drawn map found rolled in the cabin closet, penciled in a careful hand. The official maps agreed with each other. The hand-drawn one didn't. In the northeast section behind the cabin it showed trails, a creek, 3 small structures. And at the center of everything, a blank circle. No label. No notation. Just empty. A deliberate hole in the knowledge, the way honest cartographers marked what they wouldn't name. Daniel put his finger on that circle and looked at Ranger. Ranger looked at Daniel's hand, then turned his head slowly toward the back wall. The wall facing the forest. Daniel said quietly, "It's back there, isn't it?" Ranger set his chin on the table's edge and looked at the blank circle the way a man looked at a door he wasn't certain he had the right to open. He spent 2 days deciding. Not hesitating, deciding. He had learned the difference. Hesitation was fear that hadn't admitted what it was. Decision was what came after you looked fear in the face and asked what it was worth. He was afraid. He knew that without apology. Roy Callahan knew that forest 30 years and hadn't come back. Elsa's husband came home wrong. Something had crouched 1 foot from where he slept. But he thought about Roy's name spoken too carefully in that diner. He thought about Adler's locked drawer and her question that never left her. He thought about the determination no one believed, including the person who filed it. He asked Ranger what they should do. The dog watched the back window for a long moment. Then turned and wagged his tail once. A single slow arc. That was enough. He prepared with focused efficiency. Pack, bivouac kit, fire equipment, rations, water filtration, first aid, rifle and sidearm, radio locked to Adler's frequency, GPS, and a magnetic compass he trusted more than electronics in terrain that didn't behave. Harness on Ranger. A sealed letter left under a jar for Adler. Everything he knew, maps, observations, the blank circle's coordinates, the date and time of entry. If he didn't return in 4 days, someone would have a thread to follow. He stood at the back door in the gray morning light and looked at the tree line. The forest looked back, still and enormous and patient as something that had been waiting a very long time. He said okay. And they walked toward it. The forest changed him the moment he entered. Not dramatically, precisely. Temperature dropped 2 or 3 degrees exactly as Elsa described. The light shifted, not darker, but older. Heavier. And the silence. Total. Pressing against his ears like deep water. No birds. No wind in individual branches. Not the small constant noise that living forest made when it was comfortable and unobserved. A silence so complete his own breathing felt like an intrusion. Ranger worked ahead on a loose lead, nose running, professional and calm. 40 minutes in, Daniel found the rope on the tree trunk. He studied the knot. A double-wrapped locking hitch, load-bearing, requiring practice and intention. Not a trapper's knot. Not a field improvisation. Someone with military training had tied this. And the thought arrived clean and cold. Roy Callahan had not made this knot. Someone else had been here. An hour deeper, the woven structure, 15 meters across, sections weathered gray with lichen, other sections freshly cut pale with still smelling of new timber. Someone had been working on this recently. Rangers circled the perimeter with intense focus, then stopped and looked up. A canvas bag hanging from a branch on a rope. Daniel pulled it down. Inside, a notebook, a folding knife, a laminated map, and a folded paper with 3 words written in heavy pencil. They come back. Daniel stood holding that paper. And then Ranger's head snapped toward the tree line to the north, where something was moving in the shadows between the trunks. Daniel stood slowly without reaching for his rifle. He spoke into the silence, voice level, no aggression. He wasn't there to cause trouble. He'd bought the cabin by the river. He was alone except for his dog. Silence. Then movement again, closer. And a man stepped from between 2 pines. Layered in gear so worn it had forgotten its original color. Beard carrying ice crystals. Eyes pale, clear, and completely awake. The particular alertness of someone who had been paying close attention for a very long time. He looked at Daniel. Then he looked at Ranger. Ranger looked back without growling or stiffening. His tail moved once. Slow and deliberate. The man's face shifted as some calculation completed. He told Daniel to put the bag down. It wasn't his. Daniel set it in the snow and asked who the man was. The man checked the trees around them, not casually, but the way people checked for observation in places where being seen changed everything. Then he looked back at Daniel and said his name was Roy. Roy Callahan. The name didn't land as a name at first. It landed as a story that was supposed to have an ending. A grave in the Valley Cemetery with a disappearance date carved in place of a death date. A locked folder in a sheriff's drawer. A man at a diner counter who flinched. Yet Roy Callahan stood here in fresh snow, alive and simplified by years of forest the way a blade was simplified by sharpening, down to essential geometry. Daniel said Roy was reported missing. Roy said he knew. His daughter had been carrying his absence for 3 years like a stone she couldn't set down. Roy said he knew that too, and the way he said it made clear it was the part of his calculus that had cost him the most. Daniel asked why he never made contact. Roy said the only way to understand what was in this forest was to stay inside it long enough for it to stop reacting to you. To let it simply be what it was, with you present. As a hypothesis, it was patient and scientific and had clearly taken everything Roy had. Daniel asked what was in the forest. Roy looked at the woven structure and said, "Them." Daniel asked who them was. Roy was quiet for a moment, choosing words carefully. "Not people," he said finally. "Not quite." Then he looked at Ranger and said the dog had known it from the moment they arrived in the valley. The only problem was that Daniel hadn't been listening. Roy led him deeper. Temperature falling with every 100 meters. The silence intensifying. Absolute in the way silence was absolute inside a cathedral after the last note faded. After 40 minutes, Roy stopped at what looked like ordinary forest, and Daniel felt the boundary before he could see it. A coolness different from the ambient cold. A silence older than the silence around it. Roy said, "You can feel the edge, can't you?" Daniel said yes. Roy said, "Watch the dog." Ranger had stopped at an invisible line with all 4 paws together. Looking in. Not afraid. Waiting for Daniel to decide. Roy said they came out sometimes to observe. The valley, the people, the seasons. But this place was theirs. Theirs long before the first cabin was built, before the first road cut through these mountains, before any human name existed for any part of this land. Daniel asked the question Adler carried every day. He asked what they wanted. Roy looked into the hollow ground for a long moment. Then said, "To be left alone. Same as us." And then something moved inside the boundary. Slow. Deliberate. Unhurried in the way something was unhurried when time was not a resource it spent as humans spent it. A figure emerged between ancient trunks, taller than any person Daniel had ever stood beside. Human approximate but accumulating small wrongnesses the longer you looked. Torso proportioned differently. Limb angles slightly off. It stopped 20 meters inside the boundary and looked at Daniel. Eyes pale as winter sky through thin cloud, luminous with depth, enormous in patience. The patience of something that measured itself in centuries. Not threatening. Measuring. Arriving at conclusions Daniel couldn't see the working of. He breathed slowly and looked back. Not submissive, not aggressive, but the way a man looked at something he didn't understand and recognized as genuinely real. And Ranger sat in the snow at the boundary line and moved his tail once. Slowly. Almost like a bow. They camped at the edge that night. Fire small and efficient. Roy's dried venison mixed with Daniel's rations. Ranger between them, occasionally turning toward the hollow ground with calm attention. The next morning Roy introduced the others, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a researcher 18 months past her intended 2-week visit, and a quiet man named James whose notebook was dense with extraordinary observation. Daniel looked at 3 people who had each walked into mystery and found the world outside it less real than the mystery itself. He asked Yuki how she described any of this academically. She said, very carefully. The university thought she was conducting extended field research. Technically accurate, she said. The hollow ground wasn't dangerous, she told him. But it was fragile. The way anything that had survived a very long time by remaining undisturbed was fragile the moment disturbance arrived. She protected it by describing everything around it with precision and leaving the center blank. Daniel thought of the hand-drawn map's empty circle and said quietly that someone else had understood that a long time ago. He planned to stay one night. He stayed 3 days. Because on the second morning, standing alone at the boundary, understanding arrived in a form his mind had no framework for. Not a voice. Not even language. A slow, complete wave of knowing, like a dream where information arrives already formed and needs no translation. Deep and unhurried. We have been here a long time. We have watched many come and go. You are new. We are not. And quieter, beneath that, like the root note beneath a chord, the dog already knows us. He was not warning you. He was trying to introduce you. Daniel stood very still for a long time. Ranger pressed against his leg, looking into the hollow ground with calm amber eyes. And Daniel understood, felt it drop through him like cold water, that from the very first morning in the valley, from the moment Ranger went still in the parking area staring at the distant tree line, the dog had not been afraid. He had been reaching across a gap Daniel didn't know existed, trying to build a bridge between 2 forms of knowing that had been patient with each other for longer than either of them could measure. On the 3rd morning Roy woke before light, looked at the sky, and said a storm was coming, bigger than the forecast showed, faster than the timeline suggested. He pointed at Ranger. The dog sat at the camp's southern edge, rigid and focused on the ridge horizon, exactly as he had stood that very first morning in the valley parking area. Your dog has been like that since midnight, Roy said. Daniel asked if they should leave. Roy said, you and Ranger go back. Because in storms this size in this valley, people sometimes disappeared. Daniel asked if that was weather. Roy paused with the hesitation of a man choosing honesty over comfort. He said, sometimes. Daniel packed in minutes, shook Roy's iron hand. Yuki told him he didn't have to make what he'd seen fit the shape of the world outside. He just had to carry it carefully. He walked back through the ancient forest with Ranger at his heel and reached the cabin 2 hours before the storm arrived. Spent those hours stacking wood and filling containers and securing shutters. He left a radio message for Adler. Cabin secured, all well. She responded asking if he'd found what he was looking for. He told her he'd found more than he was looking for. The first gust of the storm hit the cabin minutes later, and the world outside disappeared into white. The storm lasted 2 full days. Wind driving snow horizontal, the bridge invisible, the river erased. And on the second night, 3 knocks on the door, deliberate, real, nothing like wind. Ranger was on his feet before the 3rd knock landed, but he didn't rush the door. He looked at Daniel and waited. Daniel moved to the side window. On the porch, 2 figures stood hunched against the driven snow. A woman and a young boy. He opened the door. Her face was raw from cold. The boy held her coat with both fists, eyes wide and completely dry, scared but not crying, the quiet dignity of a child trying to be brave in front of a stranger. Her car had gone off the road half a mile back. GPS had nothing, no signal. She'd seen the cabin light and walked toward it because it was the only direction that made sense. She hesitated on the threshold, the hesitation of a woman alone with a child at a stranger's door in the middle of nowhere. Ranger sat in the middle of the room and wagged his tail once, calm and certain as a declaration. The woman came inside. Her name was Carol Mayer. The boy was her nephew Marcus. 9 years old. Daniel gave them the bedroom, made soup from canned stock. Marcus sat on the floor and within 5 minutes had his arm around Ranger's neck with the absolute confidence children carried when they decided something was completely safe. At one point the boy set down a small stone, watched Ranger consider it, and then looked at Daniel and said, quietly and simply, the way children delivered true things without ceremony, Ranger knows things. Big things. Not normal things. Daniel said yes, he does. And he thought about how children still carried some perceptual range that adults trained themselves out of over years of practical, defended living. Marcus wasn't analyzing Ranger's responses. He was receiving them, trusting them completely, without needing them translated. The storm passed on the third morning, finished as if it had accomplished something and left. The sun came out over fresh deep snow. Daniel opened the door and Ranger exploded past him into 3 feet of white, bounding and plowing and rolling with a complete, uncomplicating joy. Just a dog in snow. Daniel started laughing before he realized it was happening. Not because it was funny, but because laughter had arrived without asking permission, which meant something had loosened in him that had been held tight for a very long time. Marcus appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation in 3 seconds, and launched himself into the snow. He drove Carol and Marcus back to their car once the road cleared. As they waited for the tow, Marcus wrapped both arms around Ranger's neck and asked if Ranger would ever come back. Ranger pressed his nose to the boy's cheek. Marcus laughed and looked at Daniel and said the dog had said yes, that he'd always be somewhere you could find him if you really needed him. Daniel crouched and looked into those amber eyes for a long moment and said quietly that he thought Marcus was right. That afternoon he told Adler enough. Roy was alive. There were 2 others. None of them were missing in any sense that required grieving. The forest wasn't dangerous to those who approached it with patience and respect. Adler repeated that slowly. Not dangerous. She was quiet for a time. Then she said Roy's daughter had been carrying his absence for 3 years like a stone she couldn't set down. Roy made the call from Adler's office. Adler and Daniel sat outside on the front step. Ranger leaned against Daniel's leg. Through the window they couldn't hear words, only the shape of them. Slow at first. Then faster. Higher. And then a woman's voice carrying faintly through the glass, bright and broken. Dad? Dad, is that? And Roy's reply, rough and completely certain, it's me. I'm alive. I'm okay. I'm sorry it took so long. Adler stared at the ground with her jaw tight. Daniel looked at the mountains. Ranger pressed harder against his leg, anchoring him to the present moment so none of it could drift. Spring came. The river thawed. Deer returned. Daniel repaired the porch and planted a small garden. Nothing grand, just enough to give days a shape. He visited the forest often, always with Ranger, and the communication deepened the way a language deepened when you stopped translating and started simply hearing. He learned the hollow ground was older than any number his mind could hold. Its inhabitants watched humanity not with contempt or affection but with careful, long attention, the way something measured in centuries observed something measured in decades. They were particularly interested in Ranger, as if the dog's presence bridged a gap that humans, with all their language and analysis, couldn't cross alone. The dog communicated without trying to communicate, which was perhaps the only way that kind of communication ever worked. A full year passed in Grey Hollow, marked not by ceremony but by attention, to seasons, weather, the slow, patient life of things that had decided to endure. Daniel stopped counting days. He learned that solitude wasn't the absence of connection but a different form of it. Ranger was 10 now. German Shepherds sometimes made 12, 13, 14. But Daniel didn't like looking directly at that arithmetic. What he had learned from this dog was something he hadn't known he was missing. Love wasn't a feeling that arrived and departed. Love was attention, fully given. Every morning chosen completely. Every walk inhabited from beginning to end. Every touch offered with nothing held in reserve. He'd spent 12 years trained to save lives. Ranger gave him something harder to quantify than survival. He gave Daniel the ability to be present in his own life, to inhabit it, not merely occupy it. The second autumn turned the valley gold and red. Ranger was still Ranger, alert, deliberate, magnificent. But Daniel watched with the full attention of a man who had learned to waste nothing, and he saw the small changes. A slightly slower rise on cold mornings. A longer pause before motion. An extra moment leaning into morning sunlight as if storing it deliberately. One October morning he found Ranger standing at the front window, still and unhurried, amber eyes moving slowly across the full width of the valley, the river, the ridges, the steel blue sky, as if committing it to memory. Daniel watched from the doorway until Ranger turned and held eye contact, the kind that carried entire conversations between two breaths. Daniel crossed the room, crouched, and put both hands on either side of the dog's face. He looked into those amber eyes that had seen war zones and mountain winters and ancient things in old forest. He said softly, "I know." No drama. Just the plain recognition of something real between them that had always been real and needed no ceremony. That afternoon he took Ranger to the hollow ground one last time. The forest blazed gold and red at its autumn peak. At the boundary, Ranger stopped and looked back at Daniel. Daniel unclipped the leash. Ranger crossed into the hollow ground and went deeper than he had ever gone, moving between ancient trunks with his nose high, reading the air in that deliberate way that had always looked less like sniffing and more like reading. The figure came from deep within and stopped beside the dog. Ranger pressed against its leg and sat. They stayed like that for a long time in the amber light while Daniel stood at the boundary with empty hands. The figure's pale eyes looked toward him across the distance. And something arrived, not impression, not image, but something older and simpler than both. A long, patient recognition that translated, imperfectly but truly, the dog came here without being asked. He stayed without being required. He offered without taking. That is the oldest kind of trust. We will remember him. Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't move. He received it completely. Ranger returned across the boundary as the light began to drop and pressed his head against Daniel's stomach. Daniel put both arms around him and held on without hurry. The forest held amber evening light from everywhere at once, the way a cathedral held light, distributed, sourceless, entire. Ranger exhaled one long complete breath, the kind a person exhaled when something was finished. Not ended. Finished. The way a journey was finished when everything that needed doing had been done. Daniel whispered into the dog's fur that he had been the best thing. The very best thing. And the valley held that moment carefully, the way it had always held things. Spring came again. The third spring in Gray Hollow. The river thawed. The birds returned. The deer came back to the golden meadow. Daniel walked the trail to the hollow ground alone for the first time. No leash in his hand. No amber eyes ranging ahead. No familiar weight pressed against his leg. The forest received him as it always had, temperature dropping at the tree line, ancient silence settling around him. At the boundary he stopped and waited. He had learned how to wait. The figure came and stopped at the familiar distance, pale eyes on Daniel. Daniel breathed slowly. His hands were open at his sides. And then, from somewhere deeper in the hollow ground, behind the figure, a sound. Snow shifting under paws, moving with confident, unhesitating knowledge of the ground. The sound of something completely at home. A shape moved between ancient trunks into clearer view. A dog. Black and cream. Amber-eyed. Not Ranger. But in the way its head was carried. In the angle of those eyes finding Daniel immediately and holding him with calm, complete attention, there was something unmistakably continuous. Like memory made into living motion. Like a thread running without breaking from one life into whatever came next. The young dog walked to the boundary and stopped. Waiting for Daniel to decide. Daniel crouched slowly and extended his hand, palm up, the way you offered your hand to a dog that didn't know you yet. The way you said, without words, without any language at all, "I am not a threat. I'm here. Take your time." The young dog looked at his hand, then at his face. Those amber eyes, steady and ancient in the way all dogs were ancient, carriers of an unbroken covenant older than any record any human had ever kept. Then the dog stepped forward, crossed the boundary, and pressed its nose into Daniel's open palm. Something inside Daniel settled into place, quietly and completely, like a lock turning without force. The way the truest things arrived, not with announcement or ceremony, but with simple, undeniable presence. The kind of presence that didn't ask to be believed because it simply was. Some stories end. Some continue. Some were never meant to end at all, only to deepen, season by season, like the rings inside a great tree that no one sees until the tree has been standing for a very long time. Daniel Hayes came to Gray Hollow Valley looking for silence. He found something better. He found the willingness to listen, not just to quiet, but to everything. To the wind carrying information before a storm arrived. To the way a dog moved when it knew what a man didn't. To the long, patient communication of ancient things that had been present before any word was spoken in this valley and would be present long after the last word was said. He came looking for a place to stop. He found a place to begin. Sometimes the hardest journey isn't across the world in uniform, carrying weight and orders. Sometimes it's 12 miles of mountain road, a remote cabin bought without negotiation, and a hand held open in fresh snow, and the willingness to stand at the edge of the unknown and wait. To not reach for the lock. To not step around the dog. To trust the thing that always knew. Ranger heard the storm first not because he had better ears. He heard it because he never stopped listening. Because loyalty and presence were the same thing. Because to love something fully was to give it full attention. Every morning, every walk, every breath, every silence between you, and to keep giving it, right up until the giving was done. The valley held that love carefully. In its stillness. The way it had always held things. For a very long time. Still here.